Hello again, all my friends. Today's video will probably be fairly lengthy, but I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible, and that's the reason why I've opted to do away with my intro. A couple of months ago on the YouTube Capturing Christianity, Cameron Bertuzzi put out a video titled 100 Plus Arguments for God. It was fairly lengthy, about over a 4-hour video where they tackled anything up to about 150 different arguments for God. I left a comment on the page saying that what I witnessed was 100 plus fallacies and false premises. And obviously the other Christians on the side came back at me pretty hard and said, now you've made a positive claim, you need to back it up with some evidence. If there's fallacies and false premises, the onus is on you to show it. So here it is. This is the video, 100 plus arguments for God, debunked. Alright, so before we tackle the arguments, we need to first take a look at what is it we are looking for in these arguments. Alright, so primarily these arguments are deductive arguments. This means that they have a couple of premises, and the premises lead to a conclusion. If the premises are true and valid in structure, then the conclusion that follows from the premises must be true. Alright, let's use this example. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, John is a man. Conclusion, John is mortal. Simple enough. As long as the premises are true, in philosophical terms they say that it is sound and valid. Sound, it means as long as it's true, and valid, that the structure is correct. We're not going to worry too much about the structure for this video, but the premises must be true, otherwise the conclusion cannot follow. Alright, so that's the basic structure of a deductive argument. Now we need to take a look at what are we looking for that could be potential problems in these arguments. So the first and obvious one is that the premises must be true. If there is something in a premise that is false, then the conclusion cannot be logically followed from the premises. It's not to say that the conclusion is false. It could be true for different reasons, but not for the reason of the argument. For example, if we said all men are immortal, John is a man, therefore John is immortal. It is not true that all men are immortal. All men, as far as we know, will die at some point, which makes premise 1 untrue. So if premise 1 is untrue, that is a red flag that the conclusion and that the entire argument is false. The next thing we want to take a look at is that there are no unsubstantiated assertions in the premises. Any assertion that's used in a premise must be supported by some kind of evidence, or must be able to be supported by some form of evidence. An example here might be all men except John are mortal. John is a man, therefore John is immortal. The conclusion does follow from the premises, but you don't just get to say that except John. You have to give a reason why John is the exception to the rule. This, using an unsubstantiated assertion, is the Hitchens razor, which was coined by the late great Christopher Hitchens, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. So if you're going to put an assertion in that has no backing to it, I can just ignore it safely. Alright, so the third problem we're going to look out for is the begging the question fallacy. What this means basically is, if the thing that you're trying to prove in the conclusion is used in the premises, that's begging the question and you can't use it. It's a circular argument. For example, the obvious age-old one is the claim the Bible is the Word of God. How do you know the Bible is the Word of God? Because it says so in the Bible. You can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. That is begging the question. All right, the last one we're going to take a look out for in these arguments is the non sequitur. Now, a non sequitur is where the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. For example, we could say premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, John is a man. Conclusion, therefore John has red hair. He may have red hair, but that has nothing to do with the premises of the argument. That was pulled out of the clear blue sky and had nothing to do with anything in the argument. That's a non sequitur. Okay, so now we're going to keep an eye out for these 4 problems. The unsound argument, or a premise that is false. We're going to take a look out for the begging the question fallacy, the non sequitur, and the bold assertion that has no evidence to back it. Okay, now as you would expect, whenever people speak about arguments for God, they almost always begin with some form of cosmological argument or series of cosmological arguments. This was true in this case as well. So I'm going to try and do them in the same order they did. But in some instances I'll need to swap the order around or move arguments around a bit. So let's start and see how far we get. The one I'm going to start with is Aquinas' third way. And this deals with necessary beings. Premise 1. Whatever is contingent at one time did not exist. If everything is contingent, then at one time nothing existed. If at one time nothing existed, then nothing would exist now. Something does exist now. So not every being is contingent. So there is a necessary being. Either the necessary being gets its necessity from another or exists necessarily of itself. There cannot be an infinite regress of necessary beings that get their necessity from another. So there is a necessary being that exists necessarily of itself. When it comes to cosmological arguments, a great many of them rely on necessary beings versus contingent beings, or necessary objects versus contingent objects. Just a quick explanation what this means. Contingency means 2 things. Firstly, if something is contingent, it could have not existed at some point. For example, you and I are contingent beings. If our parents hadn't met or if our parents hadn't had sex, we wouldn't have been here. So there is a possibility that we could not have been. The other thing is that a contingent being relies on something else to be there. So a contingent being, if it wasn't for my parents, I wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for their parents, they wouldn't be there, and the same for you. A necessary being is now the opposite. A necessary being has always had to have existed. It could never not have existed. And a necessary being, due to its necessity, didn't rely on something else to be there. It's just always been there. Now, in cosmological arguments, this necessary being has to be God. And everything else has to be contingent on either God or something that God produced. All right, so now in the interest of saving time, what I'm going to do is all the arguments that have to do with necessary and contingent beings, things, or objects, I've put together into one explanation. So, for example, the argument, the Samuel Clarke cosmological argument, the Leibniz cosmological argument, the Leibniz Davis-Craig one, the Leibniz PRUSS, the Gale PRUSS, the cosmological argument with principle of sufficient reason, Kuhn's simplified argument, PRUSS and RASMUSSEN'S, SCOTUS modal, and Rasmussen and Weaver. I'll flash these up on the screen briefly so that you can have a look for yourself. They went up briefly, so you can just pause the video if you want to read through it. I'm not going to go through them all. They're basically saying the same thing. They're basically speaking about necessary beings, necessary things, necessary objects versus contingent things, beings and objects. They use different words. They've got different ways of laying out, but they're essentially saying the same thing. Okay, so here's my problem with the necessary contingency argument. We've already covered that they would now say that God is the only possibility for this necessary being. I would like to, just for a moment, close your eyes and picture this. Imagine there's an entity outside of space and time. This entity has no brain, has no eyes, no sensory organs, no mouth. It doesn't consume anything. It just is. It just exists outside of space and time. This entity only has one orifice, and what it does is, at absolutely random moments, it belches out singularities of pure energy. This singularity rapidly expands into what we would call a Big Bang, creating a universe like the one that we inhabit. This thing just randomly belches out these pockets of energy that create universes. It spawns universes absolutely for no reason and absolutely randomly. How can this be different to the Christian version of a God that is spaceless, timeless, and all the attributes that they give to it? Let's call this entity Bob, purely for reference. Bob has just as much explanatory power and explanatory scope as the Christian God existing outside of space and time and creating a universe from nothing. All right, so this is what Dr. William Lane Craig has to say about the existence of God.
A beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator and designer of the universe, who is the locus of absolute moral value, and who exists with metaphysical necessity. And that would be my working definition of God.
Let's see how Bob stacks up by comparison to God. I could argue that Bob is a necessary being. It's a necessary entity. It's always existed, and it has not required anything else to bring it into existence. So Bob is necessary. He's also beginningless, always existed. He's uncaused, being a necessary being. He's timeless. He exists outside of space and time, which makes him spaceless as well. And he's immaterial. He does not have a corporeal body any more than the Christian God does. The next thing on Dr. Craig's list was enormously powerful. Now, this is very subjective. My dog has farts that are immensely powerful. It depends what you mean by immensely powerful. In every aspect that God could be claimed to be immensely powerful, Bob is equally immensely powerful. The only place where Bob differs from God is where Dr. Craig says that he's a personal being. The reason that Dr. Craig says that that God is a personal being is because he interacts with the world. He answers prayers, he produces miracles, he has a son that he sacrifices. Bob doesn't do those things. But then I would argue there is no good reason to believe that the Christian God has interacted with the world in any particular personal way. So the Christian God being personal is entirely irrelevant. Bob doesn't need to be personal. He just spawns universes. Bearing this in mind, let's take another look at one of those cosmological arguments that are lumped together in the necessary being category or the necessary object category. This is the Leibniz Davis-Craig variation. Premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation. Premise 2, the universe exists. Premise 3, so the universe has an explanation. Premise 4, if the universe has explanation, its explanation is God. Conclusion, so God exists. How would this change if we substituted God for Bob? Everything that exists has explanation, the universe exists, so the universe has an explanation. If the universe has an explanation, its explanation is Bob, so Bob exists. It works equally well. We have just used an argument for God to prove the existence of Bob, essentially God's rival. Now into this group we can also add Aquinas' first way and Aquinas' second way. This is the uncaused cause argument and the unmoved mover argument. The reason being is that when Bob spawned the universe we're living in right now, it set in motion and it caused everything that happens within this universe. So the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover is Bob. Alright, so up here we're going to put a debunkometer where we're going to count the arguments, and as we debunk them we'll add them up, and once we get to 100 plus, then we can consider the 100 plus arguments for God debunked. So to this list now we can add Aquinas' first way, Aquinas' second way, Aquinas' third way, the Samuel Clarke cosmological argument, the Leibniz one, the Leibniz-Davis-Craig variation that I just read to you now, the Leibniz-Pruss variation, the Gale-Pruss argument, the cosmological argument with principle of sufficient reason, Kuhn's argument, Kuhn's simplified argument, Pruss and Rasmussen's argument, the SCOTUS modal, and Rasmussen and Weaver's arguments. They have been on the screen. They have been on the screen briefly. You can pause it and take a look and see that they all make in one way or another the contingency necessary being object entity argument. And this argument is debunked by Bob. Alright, the next one on the list is the KALAM cosmological argument. That's probably the best known one amongst apologists and atheists, thanks to Dr. William Lane Craig, who champions the latest version. Essentially, it is a premise 1, whatever begins to exist as a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Premise 3, so the universe has a cause. The main problem I have with this argument is it's not an argument for God. It is a first cause argument, and that first cause could be whatever, but it is not an argument for God. So it doesn't count as an argument for the existence of God. The conclusion to this argument can be used as a premise in another argument that does put forward an argument for God, but the KALAM on its own doesn't. So that one off the list. Next we have Swinburne's inductive cosmological argument. Premise 1, the universe exists and is a certain way. It is complex, yet everything behaves in an orderly, law-like way. It is such as to be a suitable theatre for humans and animals to evolve. Humans evolved so as to be able to have true beliefs about the world and meaningfully act in it. Premise 2, if theism can explain why the universe exists and is this way better than naturalism, that the universe exists and is the way it makes theism more likely than naturalism. Premise 3, theism can explain why the universe exists and is this way better than naturalism. Conclusion, so that the universe exists and is the way it is makes theism more likely than naturalism. Alright, the problem with this one is in premise 3. Premise 2 says if theism explains it, then it is more likely than naturalism. And then in premise 3 it just says theism can explain it more likely than naturalism. That's just a bold assertion. You could just as easily say naturalism explains it better than theism does. You don't just get to say it, you need to show it. Then we have James Ross's modal argument. It is impossible that anything prevent the existence of God. Premise 2, for every individual X, if it is a fact that X exists or a fact that X does not exist, it is possible that there is an explanation for the fact that X exists or the fact that X does not exist. Suppose God does not exist. It is possible that there is an explanation for the fact that God does not exist. Premise 5. It is not possible that there is an explanation for the fact that God does not exist. Premise 6. It is and is not possible that there is an explanation for the fact that God does not exist. It is false that God does not exist. Alright, premise 1 is only true because in what they're saying is that God is a necessary being. And as a necessary being, he has always existed and nothing could have made him ever not exist. As we've already discovered, Bob is a necessary being. So if you were to substitute God for Bob in every one of these premises, the conclusion would still follow that it is false that Bob does not exist. This is not an argument for God, this is an argument for Bob. Next we have PRUSS and RASMUSSEN'S modal argument. For any positive state of affairs that can begin to obtain, it is possible for there to be something external to it that causes it to obtain. It is possible for there to be a beginning of the positive state of affairs, of its being the case, and that there exist contingent, concrete things. If 1 and 2 are true, then it's possible that there is a necessary concrete thing. So it is possible that there is a necessary concrete thing. If it is possible that there is a necessary concrete thing, then there is a necessary concrete thing. So there is a necessary concrete thing. Alright, so once again, I'm setting aside the fact that we are again speaking about a necessary concrete being, which Bob could substitute for. This also touches on the ANSELM arguments, the ontological arguments, which we're going to get to in a moment, where in premise 4 it says, so it is possible that there is a necessary concrete thing, and premise 5 says, if it is possible that there is a necessary concrete thing, then there is a necessary concrete thing. Just because something is possible doesn't make it exist. A possibility doesn't mean an actuality. Now, the last one of the cosmological arguments that we're going to tackle is Descartes' argument. Premise 1: there must be in the cause of an idea at least as much formal reality as the idea contains objective reality. Premise 2: I have the idea of God. My idea of God is the effect of some cause. The idea of God has infinite objective reality, so the idea of God as a cause with infinite formal reality. No finite substance, example myself, can be the cause of my idea of God. Only an infinite substance can be the cause of my idea of God, so God exists. Once again, by substituting Bob for God, what we have here from Descartes is an argument for the existence of Bob. Now we're moving on to the ontological arguments, and when it comes to ontological arguments, obviously the first one that comes to mind always is Anselm. Let's take a look at his most famous argument. A being, that which no greater can be conceived, exists at least in the mind. It is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind. So a being that which no greater can be conceived exists not only in the mind but also in reality, so God exists. The way the argument goes is that the greatest being that you can think of would be the greatest being. The only thing greater than a being you can think of is a being that actually exists. So a being that actually exists is greater than a being that you can conceive of in your mind. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being actually exists. The obvious problem here is just because you can conceive it in your mind doesn't mean it actually exists. So the problem comes in with premise 3. So a being than which no greater can be conceived exists not only in the mind but also in reality. That is false. I can conceive of many great things that remain in my mind. They don't become reality, which means that the conclusion, so God exists, falls away. The other problem with Anselm's conceivable being argument is it can be an argument for anything. It is also an argument for the invisible flying pink unicorn. Premise 1. A being than which no greater can be conceived exists at least in the mind. It is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind. So a being than which no greater can be conceived exists not only in the mind but also in reality. So the flying, invisible, pink unicorn exists. Carries just as much weight as Anselm's version where you substitute it for God. Arguing something into existence doesn't make it actually exist. It's just an argument. Now there are a couple of ontological arguments that fall into the same bracket, the same category. Again, I'm going to put them up on the screen. You can read them, pause the video, read them at your leisure. I'm not going to go through them all because they're all saying the same thing in different words. Amongst these are Anselm's first ontological argument, his second ontological argument, Anselm's other ontological argument, Plantinga's ontological, and Nagasawa's maximum opposition to the possibility premise. Next up we have Hartshorne's take on Anselm's proslogion. Premise 1, if a perfect being exists, it exists necessarily. Premise 2, either a perfect being exists necessarily or not. If not, then necessarily a perfect being does not exist necessarily. So either a perfect being exists necessarily or necessarily a perfect being does not exist necessarily. If necessarily a perfect being does not exist necessarily, then necessarily a perfect being does not exist. Either a perfect being exists necessarily or necessarily a perfect being does not exist. It's not the case that necessarily a perfect being does not exist. It's possible that a perfect being exists. A perfect being exists necessarily. Alright, so aside from that just being a whole bunch of verbal masturbation and a whole lot of word salad, again it is dealing with the necessary being. Even though it's in the ontological category, it's dealing with a necessary being. And we've already established that Bob is a necessary being. So this is an argument for the existence of Bob. Alright, once again in MAYDOLE'S reconstruction, we can see that all these arguments are essentially the same argument in different wording. Premise 1, it is possible that a perfect being exists. Premise 2, necessarily, if a perfect being exists, then a perfect being necessarily exists. Conclusion, so a perfect being exists. A couple of problems with this one. Firstly, it's not an argument for a God, it's an argument for a perfect being, which I argue Bob and many others fall into that category. It's again a necessary being argument, which we've covered several times already. And just because something possibly exists doesn't mean it actually exists. Alright, let's take a look at the phenomenal defense. Premise 1, it appears to me that God possibly exists. Premise 2, it is reasonable for me to believe that if it is impossible that God exists, it would probably appear to me that it is impossible that God exists upon further reflection. Conclusion, so I am prima facie justified in believing that God possibly exists. My problem here, apart from all the obvious ones we've dealt with already, is premise 2. For a Christian, it would be reasonable to believe that God exists, which would make premise 2 true. But for a non-believer, there's no reason to reasonably believe that God exists. So from any other standpoint, aside from a Christian point of view, premise 2 is faulty. It has a false statement. I could just as simply reword it the following way. Premise 1. It appears to me that God possibly does not exist. And it appears to me that way my justification is understanding the way Big Bang cosmology, understanding how the world works, aside from faith statements. To me it appears that God does not exist. Premise 2. It is reasonable for me to believe that if it is possible that God exists, it would probably appear to me that it is possible that God exists upon further reflection. So, as a conclusion, I am prima facie justified in believing God possibly does not exist. My reworded argument makes just as much sense as the original, where I've just swapped out possibly for possibly not. Now I'd like to take a look at Gödel's ontological argument. What they have here are 3 definitions, 5 axioms, and then the 3 derivatives. The problem here for me is in the first definition is one of them. Something is godlike, and they argue that by definition something is godlike if it has all the positive properties. That is assuming God is all good. If God was not all good, he wouldn't have every possible positive property. If God was evil, he would have every possible negative property. So you don't just get to say that something is godlike if it is has every possible positive property. Unless what you're doing is you're just saying godlike as a noun. You're just using it as a descriptor for every possible property, possible positive property. If that's the case, then when it gets down to the conclusions, all 3 conclusions use the phrase godlike. So if godlike is just a noun for goodness, well, yes, then following those conclusions, it is possible that something has goodness. Goodness is the essence of what it is to be called goodness, and there is goodness in the world. Essentially, the whole Gödel argument is one large tautology. All right, so next up we have Pruss's improvement on what was already a weak argument. The 3 axioms being, if P is positive, then not P is not positive. If P is positive and P entails Q, then Q is positive. Necessary existence is positive. Given axiom 1 to 3, then there is a necessarily existent being that essentially has P. Aside from the fact that axiom 2 is entirely irrelevant, axiom 3 then says necessary existence is positive. There's no reason to believe that a necessary existence has to be positive. It could be absolutely neutral. Bob, who just belches out universes, is neither positive nor negative. The positivity and negativity comes about as a result of the end product of the spawning of that universe, entirely disconnected from that necessary entity. All right, now we move on to the arguments from design. And we're going to start with the Aquinas' 5th way, which reads, whatever has ends or goals is either intelligent or is directed by intelligence. Efficient causes in nature have ends or goals and work together towards the goal of harmony and order. Efficient causes in nature are not intelligent, so efficient causes in nature are directed by intelligence. The problem with this argument comes from the first premise. Whatever has ends or goals is either intelligent or is directed by intelligence. All right, so the Aquinas' 5th way, simplified, reads, intelligence underlies teleology. There is irreducible teleology immanent to the natural order, so intelligence underlies the natural order. Teleology means purpose. So premise 1 is saying that intelligence underlies purpose, but we've already established that life has no intrinsic purpose. Then we have the Etienne-Gilson justification, which reads, to admit that things order themselves by accident is to admit that there is room in the universe for an effect, namely their very order without a cause. For it, the form proper to each body is sufficient to explain the particular function of that body, yet it by no means explains why the different bodies and their different functions arrange themselves in a harmonious whole. All right, the first part of the first sentence, to admit that things order themselves by accident. There's also no reason to believe that things order themselves automatically. We put order to things as people. The universe doesn't order itself by accident. The formation of stars and things like that happen because of the mass of objects and gravity that pulls each other together. That's not by accident. That's following the laws of gravity. As a matter of fact, entropy has the world falling apart, not ordering itself. Next, we take a look at design in biology, the origin of organic life. Premise 1. Given what we know, complex organic life in the universe could not have originated naturalistically. If, given what we know, complex organic life in the universe could not have originated naturalistically, it's reasonable to believe it originated supernaturalistically. So it's reasonable to believe that complex organic life originated supernaturalistically. Alright, so premise 1. We do not know that life could not have originated naturalistically. There have been many experiments done, the Urey-Miller experiment, for example, where it has been shown that life could come about from non-life. Granted, that experiment perhaps couldn't have been accurate for how the Earth actually was in its early stage, but it did show that it is possible for life to come from non-life given the correct circumstances. So it is not true to say, given what we know, complex organic life in the universe could not have originated naturalistically. It very well could have originated naturalistically. We just don't know the exact way that it actually happened. All right, Chandler's divine intervention argument. Given that God intervenes to produce life on earth, there is no chance at all that there will be no life on earth. The probability of the conjunct God intervenes to produce life on earth and life does not occur on earth is 0. If God does not intervene to produce life on earth, the probability that life will occur here is very low. It is just as reasonable to bet that God will intervene to produce life on earth as that he won't. The subjective probability is around 50-50. But there will be life on earth, so it is very likely that God will intervene to produce life on earth. There is so much wrong with this argument. Alright, premise 1. Given that God intervenes to produce life on earth. That is not a given. We do not know for a fact that God intervenes to produce life on earth, so that is not a given. Premise 2. If God does not intervene to produce life on earth, the probability that life will occur here is very low. Very low is very different to 0. So even if premise 2 was true up until that point, we would then be saying that if God does not intervene to produce life on earth, there will be no life on earth. But they're not saying that. They're saying the possibilities that life occurring here will be very low. Whether or not it is very low, even if there's a small chance of life without God's intervention, that is a possibility and what could have happened. So premise 2 doesn't necessitate a God. So the conclusion, so it is very likely that God will intervene to produce life on earth, is a false statement. You cannot draw that conclusion from the faulty premises 1 and 2. We have the design in biology, organic structures. Some things in nature resemble human artifacts. Human artifacts are the product of intentional design, so we should infer that things in nature that resemble human artifacts are also products of intentional design. If there are things in nature that are products of intentional design, God exists, so God exists. Alright, so aside from the bold assertion in premise 4, where they say if there are things in nature that are products of intentional design, God exists. How do you get to just put God in there? Why would God exist? You could substitute that with anything. Zeus, the invisible flying pink unicorn, which would make the conclusion, so the invisible flying pink unicorn exists, would make that true. I would agree with premise 2 that human artifacts are a product of intentional design. We make things and we make them to look a certain way. The problem comes in premise 1, where they say that some things in nature look like some things that we would make. So because they resemble the things that we would make, we made them intelligently. So because they resemble it, they were also made intelligently. That doesn't follow. Just because something resembles something doesn't mean it is. I mean, we as humans are pattern-seeking machines. We can look at something that ordinarily would have no association with something else, and we would make it in our minds look like something else. It would resemble that thing purely to us, yet it was not intended to look like that thing that man made, aside from the fact that it wouldn't serve the same purpose anyway. Next, they have what they call the more faithful version of this argument. If X is design-like, then X can only be the product of intentional design. Some things in nature are design-like, so some things in nature are products of intentional design. Clearly, this is just a rewording of the previous argument, and the same counter-arguments are just as valid. Okay, moving on to PRUSS's analogical. DNA is like an intentionally designed computer program. Intentionally designed computer programs have intelligent designers. If DNA is like an intentionally designed computer program, it too probably has an intelligent designer. So DNA probably has an intelligent designer. Even if DNA could be compared to a computer program, which is an association only we make, we know that DNA came about as a result of purely biochemical adaptations over a period of time. DNA evolved from RNA, which evolved from more primitive organic substances. So DNA is an evolution of a structure from a very simple beginning to a more complex version of what it is now. It is not a computer program. We only make it sound like a computer program. Yes, computer programs are designed. There's no reason to believe that DNA was designed in any way. It is a simple evolution. Next, their argument, design in biology, information. Information is inherent to the building blocks of life. Information is the product of intelligence. If information is inherent to the building blocks of life, then the building blocks of life themselves are the byproduct of intelligence. So the building blocks of life are the byproduct of intelligence. The problem here is the same problem we always have when people compare DNA to a million encyclopedias. The information in a DNA strand is more words than you could find in encyclopedias. Information, the word information is very loosely used when we're speaking about biological structures. The way DNA operates is not like a word or a block of information. It is merely chemical processes that copy each other and act on other chemicals in a way to make a chemical exchange that produces a byproduct. In its simplest form, that's what DNA is. It is not information. We call it information, and it helps us understand what is happening in DNA. But it is not inherently information. That is just how we view it. So the first premise, which reads information is inherent to the building blocks of life, that is false. information is not inherent in the building blocks of life. Alright, so now we have Tennant's argument from cosmic teleology. The universe is conspicuously suitable for intelligent moral beings in many ways. There is just one universe with the necessary ingredients for life. Those ingredients have come together, at least in one place, to make an environment not just habitable but conducive to the flourishing of organic life. Some of those world's flourishing inhabitants find the world intelligible, namely us. Being intelligible, they also find it beautiful. All of these facts together suggest the unfolding of a plan, behind which is purposive intelligence. If the universe is conspicuously suitable for intelligent moral in many ways, then it should be regarded as a theatre for the lives of intelligent moral agents designed by God. So the universe should be regarded as a theatre for the lives of intelligent moral beings designed by God. Wow, again, so much wrong with this argument. Premise 1a. There is just one universe with the necessary ingredients for life. You don't know that. There may be multiple universes out there that have the necessary ingredients for life. Just because we can't investigate them doesn't mean you have the right to just ignore them. Just because this is the only universe we know about doesn't mean we get to say there is just one universe with the necessary ingredients for life. One of the other problems that I often find, and people very easily overlook, they say this universe is designed for intelligent life, namely us. In the known universe, the only place we know of where we could possibly survive is this little ball of rock floating in an immense universe. Everywhere outside of our atmosphere, the universe is designed to kill us. We cannot survive there. Now, even if we look at just our Earth, 70% of it is water. We cannot survive there, not without additional equipment. On our own, we cannot survive there, which leaves 30% of this tiny speck of dust in the entire universe that we can live off of. Even on that 30%, we can't live comfortably in deserts. We can't live in Antarctica or the Arctic Circle without equipment. The amount of area that we can comfortably survive and flourish is fractionally small compared to the size of the universe. So the universe is not designed for us. We are lucky to be able to survive on the tiniest fraction of a portion of it. We survive despite the design of the universe, if there was a design. We do not survive as a result of it. Premise 2, which reads, if the universe is conspicuously suitable for intelligent moral in many ways, then it should be regarded as a theatre for the lives of intelligent moral agents designed by God. Yeah, you have to ask the question, why designed by God? You would have to already believe in God to accept premise 2. If you believed in some other God that created the universe, if you believed in Brahma, then you could just as well end off premise 2 with moral agents designed by Brahma. You don't get to just assert God in there, especially if God is going to be in your conclusion. Alright, now we move on to the fine-tuning arguments. And the first one we're going to start with is fine-tuning by elimination, and this is William Lane Craig's go-to fine-tuning argument. Premise 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is due either to chance, physical necessity, or design. Fine-tuning is not due to either chance or physical necessity, so the fine-tuning is due to design. Alright, when it comes to fine-tuning, there's something we need to bear in mind. Firstly, by fine-tuning, what we're talking about is that the constants in the universe that allow us to be able to exist as we do now, where we do now, have to be so finely tuned that even if it was off by the slightest amount, life as we know it, or the universe as we know it, wouldn't have been able to exist. Let's take one example. Let's take the size of the Earth. If the Earth had been slightly larger, gravity would have increased, or if the Earth had been slightly smaller, gravity would be less. If the Earth had been significantly larger and gravity had been 3-4 times what it is now, we wouldn't be able to survive. But there probably would be creatures that would have big, thick, stumpy legs that moved very low down to the ground to counteract gravity. They'd be low, slow, lumbering creatures across the ground who, for them, gravity would not be such an issue because they'd have massive muscular structure, low center of gravity. They would be able to contend with this extra gravity. Now, on the other side, if the Earth had been much smaller and gravity much less, we probably wouldn't be able to exist either. But there would be other animals that would be able to survive. So most animals would have flight. They would be lighter. They would probably spend most of their time existing in the air. The point either way is that us as humans wouldn't be able to exist there, but there would be something existing in either scenario and existing quite comfortably. Now adjust all these parameters, a little bit this way, a little bit this way, and keep adjusting them. Those creatures that are brought up now for the larger and smaller Earth maybe wouldn't have existed, but something else would have. And doesn't matter how you formulate these adjustments, something would have evolved to be able to live under those conditions. And that something would have thought that the world was fine-tuned for them. We just say it is fine-tuned for us because we are the ones that are able to live under these conditions where we do right now. Alright, so bearing that in mind, let's return back to the argument. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is either due to chance, physical necessity, or design. Fine-tuning is not due to either chance or physical necessity. We don't get to say that. How do we know that the fine-tuning was not due to chance? The fine-tuning ended up the way it was, and we ended up and we evolved to live under these conditions. This, what we call fine-tuning, could very well have happened and probably did very well happen by chance. So if premise 2 is faulty, we cannot rely on the conclusion to be accurate. Right, next we have fine-tuning for discoverability. The values of certain physical constants fall within the discoverability optimality range within the anthropic range. If naturalism is true, it is enormously improbable that the values of certain physical constants would fall within the discoverability optimality range within the anthropic range. If theism is true, it is not improbable that the values of certain physical constants, carries on, conclusion, so that the values of certain physical constants would fall within the discoverability optimality range within the anthropic range strongly confirms theism over naturalism. Premise 2 and premise 3 are just bold assertions. If naturalism is true, it is enormously improbable that the values of certain physical constants would fall within the range. We don't get to say that. I could just as well say, if theism is true, it is enormously improbable that the values would fall within those ranges. And premise 3 you could substitute as well, where they say, if theism is true, it is not improbable. You could substitute it with, if naturalism is true, it is not improbable. So just by putting in a bold assertion in premise 2 and 3 doesn't make the conclusion true. Alright, and the last of the design arguments we're going to take a look at is perceiving design. Premise 1, if X appears design-like, then X is justifiably taken to be the product of intentional design. Premise 2, some things in nature appear design-like. Conclusion, so some things in nature are justifiably taken to be the products of intentional design. Alright, we've dealt with this already. Just because something looks like it's designed doesn't mean it is designed. If things in nature appear design-like, they just appear design-like. They appear design-like because we give it that significance. There is no reason to believe they are designed. Appearance is not the same as actuality. Now we move on to the moral arguments for God. And the first one is the objectivity of morality. Premise 1, morality is objective only if God exists. Premise 2, morality is objective. Conclusion, so God exists. Alright, we don't get to say in premise 1 only if God exists. There could be many reasons why morality is objective. Morality could be objective if man as a whole agrees on something. That would make it objective. If we all agree that something, a particular thing is moral, that makes it morally objective. Has nothing to do with God. So even if morality is objective, it doesn't necessarily follow from the conclusion, so God exists. It could be objective through our combined agreement on the subject. And here we are again using the circular argument. You cannot use God in premise 1 as the thing that you're trying to prove in the conclusion. That is begging the question. Once again, we could substitute Bob for God in this argument. Morality is objective only if Bob exists. Morality is objective, so Bob exists. This is not an argument for God. This is an argument for Bob. Now, exactly the same thing goes for the next argument, which is the abductive version. Morality is objective. If morality is objective, God is the best explanation for its being objective. So God is the best explanation for morality's being objective. So probably God exists. Or in the conclusion, so probably Bob exists. Exactly the same argument, different wording. Next up, we're going to look at the normative implications of evil. Evil contrastively implies that there is a way the world ought to be. There is a way the world ought to be only if there is an intention or goal or design or purpose behind it. So there is an intention or goal, design or purpose behind the world. There is an intention or goal or design or purpose behind the world only if God exists, so God exists. Alright, premise 4, we have the circular argument again. You don't get to say only if God exists, if that's the thing that you're trying to argue for in the conclusion. Premise 2, there is a way the world ought to be only if there is an intention or goal or design or purpose behind it. We don't know that there is an intention or goal or design or purpose behind it. That is just a bold assertion that needs to be justified. Until we can show that any one of those are true, we don't get to include them. Alright, next up we have evil as privation of the good. Premise 1, evil is a privation of goodness. Premise 2, if evil is a privation of goodness, goodness is ontologically and explanatory prior to evil. Premise 3, if goodness is ontologically and explanatory prior to evil, there is more goodness in the world than evil. Premise 4, if there's more goodness in the world than evil, probably God exists. Conclusion, so probably God exists. We could very easily swap this whole thing around. If we swapped around good and evil, what would we end up with? Let's have a look. Premise 1, good is the privation of evil. Premise 2, if good is the privation of evil, then evil is ontologically and explanatory prior to goodness. If evil is ontologically and explanatory prior to goodness, there is more evil in the world than good. If there is more evil in the world than good, probably God exists, so probably God exists. Now we are arguing that God exists because there is more evil than goodness in the world. And I don't think this is what they're aiming for. And once again, in premise 4, how do we just get to say God exists? Wouldn't there be more goodness in the world than evil if probably Brahma exists, or Quetzalcoatl, or Ahura Mazda? We don't just get to say it's God. Okay, so we move on to the horrendous evils argument. Premise 1, some evils are so horrendous that they seem to have a non-naturalistic dimension to them. If following on 1, we are justified in thinking they do have a non-naturalistic dimension to them. Premise 3, the best explanation of their being evil so horrendous that they have a non-naturalistic dimension is that good and evil have deep spiritual significance. Premise 4, so probably good and evil have deep spiritual significance. 5, if good and evil have deep spiritual significance, then something like theism is probably true. So something like theism is probably true. In premise 1, some evils are so horrendous that they seem to have a non-naturalistic dimension to them. That is an assertion we don't just get to make. You could just easily say some evils are so horrendous they could only have a natural dimension to them. We don't just get to throw in non-naturalistic dimension. For that we would need some evidence. All right, so if we don't get to throw in the non-naturalistic dimension, then premise 3, then it having a deep significant spiritual significance, also falls away. All right, so then if we get to ignore premise 4, then premise 5 doesn't carry any weight either. If good and evil have deep spiritual significance, then something like theism is probably true. We don't get to say that it has deep spiritual significance, so then we don't need to worry about the portion that says something like theism is probably true. So we can abandon the conclusion that something like theism is probably true. Another thing to bear in mind here, now that they're talking about deep spiritual significance, is it possible that there could be a spirit realm or a non-naturalistic realm somewhere, and yet God does not exist? If God did not exist and we could exist on the physical earth, it is just as possible that a spiritual world could exist without a God existing either. The spirit realm could be residing on another dimension, the fourth or fifth dimension. So even if this argument was pointing to something with deep spiritual significance, it does not automatically follow that theism would be true. It would just mean that a spiritual realm could exist in the same way we do without a God. All right, moving on to universal moral beliefs. Premise 1, certain moral beliefs are shared by all of humanity. If certain moral beliefs are shared by all of humanity, God is the best explanation of that. So God is the best explanation of there being certain moral beliefs shared by all of humanity, so probably God exists. God need not be the only reason that all of humanity shares certain moral beliefs. We could within ourselves be extremely uncomfortable with killing another person, purely because we are empathic beings who have the ability to reason. We don't want other people harming us, so we wouldn't want to harm other people. If we feel that way in Africa, it is possible that other people in Europe could feel exactly the same way, and people in the Americas could feel exactly the same way, and people in Asia could feel exactly the same way, and people in Australasia could feel exactly the same way. So all of humanity could share certain moral beliefs without God being the best explanation of that joint belief.